Welcome to Future Foodcast. I'm Pam Linemiller, your host. I want to thank our sponsor, Farm to Plate. They are creating tomorrow's food business ecosystem today. You can find out more at farmtoplate.io. And our interviewee today, it's so exciting. I'm in the United States and he's all the way around the world in India. I want to introduce you to Sanjay Dasari. He is the co-founder of WayCool Foods. Welcome to the podcast, Sanjay.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, we are excited to unpack some of the things you have going on there. Why don't you tell us a little bit about WayCool Foods and how you got started, why you even founded this company?
Absolutely. So it's a bit of a long story. So we initially had the idea in 2014 when I was a junior at Babson College in Boston, and it's a small school outside Boston focusing on entrepreneurship. And the idea for me was always to come back to India and start a business that had some kind of a social enterprise kind of a focus to it. So naturally, I gravitated towards food and agriculture, food security, farmer welfare, the impact of food and food wastage on the climate. All of these different elements in 2014, 2015 were really, really exciting and kind of coming together as this opportunity for us to focus and build. So I'm sure we'll get into more of the conversation about like the Indian agri ecosystem and like how this business makes sense. But effectively, what we do as a company today is we have built demand-driven food value chains for about 20 to 25 key SKUs or key products for the entire farm to fork supply chain in India. And building off of the skill set that we've built there, we have started to create a house of food and grocery brands that we then take to our mom and pop stores or e-commerce customers of the cities, and we have them distributed to end consumers across primarily South India today, but eventually towards a more national and international audience.
Sanjay, you have a lot going on. Obviously, you saw a need there in India for what you're doing. So let's jump in a little bit. Explain, because we do have a worldwide audience. We do have a lot of people in North America and Europe that are not in India. Can you help us understand the climate there? You referenced like farm to fork. What is it like there with farms in India? I mean, explain to us what the ecosystem looks like.
No, it's a great question because as we have spoken to people outside of India about what the company does, it's really important for us to set that context around the structural process of how the Indian agricultural system works. And I'll start all the way back at the farm level. Average farm holding in the US might be between 500 to 600 acres per farm. So they're fairly large scale farms in the US. Whereas in India, the average farm holding is about 2.5 acres per farm. So your traditional, let's say, combine harvesters that might work on a US farm can't even fit on an Indian farm, let alone add value to the process that's happening. So you already have a case of extreme fractionalization at the agricultural level, so the front or the beginning of the supply chain. And then you have a very high cost rather, of first mile aggregation, as we say, because in any supply chain company, the first thing you want to do is make sure that if you're transporting something in a truck, that truck is as full as possible. So your cost per unit comes down as much as possible. So in order to fill that truck in the US, you go to one farm because that farm's large enough to fill your truck. In India, you have to buy from multiple different farmers. So already that cost of first mile aggregation has not only the cost element, but the complexity element, because you have farmers and then many aggregators and then transporters who kind of all come together as multiple different layers just to fill that first truck at the beginning of the value chain. Incidentally, the exact same problem happens on the front end of the value chain as well. Whereas in the US, you have Costco's, Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, these large-scale supermarkets that you can look at to send one large truck of produce and they'll take care of it themselves. In India, up to 95% of food and grocery consumption in the cities happens with small, disorganized mom and pop stores. There is really no large-scale organized player in the retail space. And while they are growing, upwards in 85 to 95% of the country still buys their food and grocery from these small stores. So that same cost of first mile aggregation is replicated with your last mile disaggregation. We have a wholesaler, semi-wholesaler, transporter to your retailer, and then goes to the end consumer at the end of the day. So it's really that, for lack of a better term, insanity that happens in the supply chain, which is the most fascinating things to us as entrepreneurs, because it is one of the most effective value chains in the world, but also quite inefficient. And what I mean by that is you have nearly 12 million of these mom and pop stores across the country in India, each of whom are getting between 75 to 100 different SKUs freshly delivered to their stores every single morning. So it's effective, it works. It just could be working a lot better. And that's really what triggered the whole conversation about how do we fix the supply chain and the value chain for food in India, addressing the informational gaps, the food wastage gaps, the transportation inefficiencies, etc. That's kind of where things started to snowball, and we picked it up from there.
Yeah, it sounds like I mean that supply chain. I first of all, I love that there's small farmers there that you're able to help get their product to the consumers. The second thing I love is that Indians buy their food every 2 to 3 days, which is fresh food. Whereas in a lot of other parts of the world, the bags and the boxes in the middle of what we call our grocery stores get purchased far too often. So I imagine Indians are a lot healthier, maybe because a result of
Hopefully.
actually buying products from the farm, hopefully. And I like that part about it, but I can see where there would be a need to bring those two together because neither one, you have a small entities, like you said, very fractional entities, not one big farm to one big store like you might have in a lot of places. So you're helping on both ends of that with what you're doing. So you're communicating with the farmers as well as with those local store owners.
That's right. And I think the
Wow.
way that we looked at this supply chain is took a lot of inspiration from two seemingly different industries. The first, and this is where I came from, 'cause I was an undergrad in Boston and I would go to Chipotle quite often and be inspired by how they built their supply chain. And so I was looking at the food industry initially, and I noticed that they got to a certain point where they had enough scale and buying power to influence upstream supply chain practices. So if you wanted to supply to Chipotle, you had to follow a certain set of practices as to how you process meat, for example, how you grew lettuce. We all know about the outbreak that happened a few years ago on the E. coli side, for
Yeah.
example. So they became very critical about how their suppliers sort of built their supply chains, and that was pretty exciting to me because it came from an idea of looking at the demand first and working backwards. At the same time, my co-founder, Karthik Jayaraman, who was in India working on the automotive industry, he was looking at the trucks and bus manufacturing space and saying that, okay, this industry already operates in the exact same way. They operate what is traditionally known as a demand-driven supply chain. So they forecast demand into the future, convert that into manufacturing plans, and then manufacture to forecasted demand. So that way you're very efficient as an automotive industry. So we were talking one day and put these two things together and say, why don't we just do this for the agricultural and food space? So that information transparency gap that's there today, where your farmer doesn't know what the retail store is going to want for 45 to 50, 60 days in the future when it's time to harvest, if you can bridge that information gap, that's step one of the problem solved. Step two is the physical supply chain itself. And it's this mixture of the demand forecasting model that we put in place to have a demand-driven supply chain, and the physical intervention that we've done with our own collection centers, our own automated warehouses, etc., that have helped us reduce our supply chain food wastage from the industry standard of 17 to 35% of the industry to
Oh,
1 to 1.5% for us. So significant decrease, obviously, on the wastage side.
that's a really significant decrease. And because that is one of the problems that is, at the forefront of our food industry issues as far as the spoilage or wastage of food and getting lost in the supply chain or otherwise spoiling, or like you said, the safety issues, which we haven't really touched on yet, but you're just trying to shorten that amount of time and help get, because you have with fresh food, there's not a lot of shelf life there.
Mhm.
You've got to respond. I mean, you have to
Yeah.
pick it up, you have to drop it off. There's
Mhm.
there's a short time frame when you're talking about farm to getting it to the small retailers.
Absolutely, and I love that point because that was actually our thesis as well in 2014 when before we started the company. There's a reason the company is called WayCool, and the genesis of the name was that we took inspiration from business models that worked in the West and said, okay, India has a food wastage problem, Therefore, you need cold storage and cold logistics. So the initial idea was to have a cold chain company that could transport food from farm to fork. But the more we drilled down and understood how India is structured, a lot of the consumption in cities happens from sourcing regions within around like 100 to 200 kilometers away from where it's being consumed. So you don't have a situation where, like in the US, things are being grown in like the middle of the country, being sent to each coast. In India, it's often already quite localized in terms of how they procure and how they eat. So a lot of our supply chain on the fruits and vegetables side is 4 hours up to 24 hours from harvest to
Wow.
reaching the customer store shelves. And if you go that fast, you don't need cold chain. And because of that, we don't actually have much cold chain in our company anymore. But the name of WayCool has still stuck since then.
But now way cool still fits because you're doing way cool stuff with the
Thank you.
industry, right? So you can you can still
We
claim
like
it. We're just going to change the definition a little bit.
we like to
Speak. Yeah, I didn't know. Thanks for sharing your initial intent, and then once you got feet on the ground, you realized, hey, if we structure it this way, we can eliminate because there's a lot of cost involved with trying to set up the cold uh, storage and transportation. I mean, that's a lot more expensive, and especially with the climate, what the climate can be in India, I can imagine that would be a challenge. Can you help before we move on? For our listeners to actually quantify, because we say yes, there's lots of small farms and there's lots of small stores. Some of the numbers there, because for those of us just in less populated areas to know, because we're in the multiple thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands on some of these from when we talked before. Can you share that a little bit with like the neighborhood stores versus the farms and some of the
Absolutely.
numbers there?
Absolutely. No, India is, as you'd be aware, it's a very populous country. So we have, at the latest census, about 50% of the population, which is about 700 million people, claimed agriculture as a primary source of income.
Wow.
That doesn't mean that they do farming themselves only, but they have something to do in the agricultural farming value chain.
Okay.
So that's 700 million people who are involved in agricultural processes in this industry. Of that, about 120 million people define themselves as full-time farmers. That's people who are actually operating their own land, or they own the land, or they're leasing from somebody else, but they're doing farming as a business. That doesn't count the people who are deployed as labor on their lands, or people who are working ancillary services. So still 120 million people on the farming side. On the neighborhood stores piece, we have about 10 to 12 million of these mom and pop stores where people go downstairs and like buy from their corner stores every single day. So that's 10 to 12 million of these stores on the front end.
Okay, see, those numbers are staggering to some, like me. I didn't realize we were in the millions, but when you take in the entire country of India, it's a very large country, and you're providing service there. So tell me where you are so that we can conceptualize.
So we source from across the country, and we do importing as well. And we say that if it's something that grows best in a certain region, we're going to go find it there and buy from there. Like apples, Indian apples, for example, grow best in either Kashmir or the state called Himachal Pradesh. So we go and source it from there, even though those are North India. But our distribution network of where we supply to these mom and pop stores is almost entirely in the southern part of the country. We've made it a point to, as we like to say, inch wide, mile deep philosophy. So go as deep as possible. And if we're going to be in a certain zip code, we want to make sure we dominate that zip code. So if there's a town or city in South India that has more than 10,000 people in population, which is a very, very small town by Indian standards, then we will likely have distribution available in those cities, either through a partner or through our own distribution network. And that is a considerable scale we've been able to achieve as well, because we want to be across the southern states before we even consider going north or west or east, because there's more than enough potential. To give you an idea of the scale, those 5 southern states that we operate in India today is about $350 billion of food and grocery on the B2B side alone. The whole country is about 800 billion, so South alone is 350 or so of that.
Yeah, that's nearly half the potential. That's a very rich, I would say. There's plenty of work to be done there. Now,
Yeah.
what you talked about with just connecting the farmers and the stores, that's not all you do. Don't you have other things you're focused on at WayCool? Do you want to share about that with our audience?
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
we structured ourselves into three different parts of the business. We have the fresh value chain, which is our fruits and vegetables business. In that, we have two of our own brands as well. We have a brand called L'Exotique, which is our imported fruits brand. We tie up with orchards across the world, either package it there or package it once it comes to the country, and we distribute these to our network of retail stores and distribution partners. We have a second brand called Desi Fresh, which is Indian fruits that we export and take to the rest of the world as well. So both the import side and export side on the fruits and vegetables branded pieces taken care of. The second vertical that we have as a business is our staples business. So this is rice, lentils, dairy products. We have our own line of bread, of yogurt, of ghee, which is clarified butter. And we this is where the bulk of our branded goods sort of sit. Now, what I described about the value chain of forecasting demand and working backwards with farmers and players in the value chain, that same thesis still holds true for the staples business. It's a little bit more complicated because you have to work with millers and packaging partners and sort of these more value additive steps in between. But the thesis is still the same, and that's the whole branded goods piece. So we have three brands there as well: Madhuram, Kitchen G, and Freshies, which all have different sort of niches that we've carved out for the B2C space. And finally, the third piece of the business, which is the youngest, but very, very exciting all the same. About a year and a half ago, we took the call to take all of the technology that we had built for the supply chain that we're operating and drop it down into an independent subsidiary, wholly owned subsidiary, to offer our supply chain tech stack to other companies across the world. So the company is called Sensa, CENSA, and they were technically a year and a half old, but because they've been building WayCool's tech stack for the past 8.5 years, they have quite a bit of understanding of how this works. And today they have customers who are using our proprietary tech stack in Morocco, in the Middle East, in India. A bunch of customers are talking to in the US, in Brazil, and Colombia as well. And it's really exciting to see that there are these different modules, whether it be farm management or distribution or supply chain or processing, or whatever you might need to do in a food supply chain business. We have a tech solution for you. And that's the third and latest part of the business that we set up just recently.
Yeah. Very cool. Pun
Thank you.
intended. I'm sorry. I am going to that word because I keep thinking way cool in my brain. You have so much happening and so much potential, Sanjay. I mean, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience about your company, about the future, about the agricultural business in India, or whatever might be going on your mind?
No, absolutely. Thank you. It's one of these spaces that are the most exciting, and it's like it feels like it's been on the cusp of a tipping point for the past couple of decades or so. There's always something really exciting happening, and for me and for WeCool at large, we have we spend a lot of time thinking about the intersection between what we do in the food value chain, and of course, food security, food quality and quantity are both really important to solve for. Not just the availability of food, but also the nutritional benefits of that food itself, but also the impact that this food value chain has on the climate as well. So realizing that food wastage in food supply chain is the second leading contributor to climate change, and what can we do as a company to help address that? Of course, reducing food wastage is a big part of it, but we're on our way now to covering about 50% of our Scope 2 emissions as we sort of drive towards covering all of Scope 2 and then tackling the massive Scope 3 emissions problem. But this idea that we have the company is climate smart, is business smart, because it's one of those things where if the climate continues to change as we're seeing it, then the first industry that's going to be impacted is probably going to be our agricultural industry. And the first country that's going to be severely impacted is the Indian sort of ecosystem where a lot of the food is being grown for this region. So from a international food security angle as well, climate change and food security are pretty, pretty important for us to be thinking about. So while the conversation has really been driving us towards this goal and this vision over the past few years, we're excited to see a lot more conversations about this topic come up over the past few years on like multiple international forums. So that's been pretty exciting. Quite a departure from the from our initial ideas of a cold chain company in South India, but it feels good to be part of a larger movement like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like you have already made a big impact and have plans to keep that trajectory going. So you're going to keep making big impacts and influencing what's happening there in India and other places as you grow. That's very exciting. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. If you enjoyed this interview with Sanjay and would like to hear more interviews like this, please let us know. Comment on this episode. Follow our podcast, and we will see you next week. I'm Pam Linemiller.
Thanks for listening to Future Foodcast. Future Foodcast is powered by Farm to Plate, the leading food blockchain platform. Subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date with the very latest innovations in the food industry.